Hey, it's Chris. What are we talking about today? Ice. Ice. Not making that joke. What do you need to know? This is a second edition from This Way Games. Coming to GameFound, it's going to show you, do you like sort of an abstract style Euro game with layering, literal layering of tiles? Five Tribes-esque, but is that a pro or a con? Let's talk. What do you need to know? Right for you? Wrong for you? Let's go. The concept of ice is relatively straightforward. All it is moving around a hexagonally based grid, slowly peeling off layers of these hexagonal tiles, reaping the rewards of what's on the other side as they're face down initially and get turned face up on a limited action turn-by-turn basis, trying to then gather these resources that are going to get you victory points in the end in many different ways of utilizing set collections as your main way of scoring. So ice is really broken down into three main phases here. And they're, again, very straightforward. What you're going to have here is your ice board, your player board. Individually, you can see that there are several elements on this board. Asymmetric power, storage area for tiles gathered, and then your action points of allocating and keeping track of how many you've got going on. And you typically, at the beginning of a round, start with 5. You can modify that slightly depending on what actions you take. Then, all you do is reveal an event card, a logbook, and you play this game over 4 rounds before the winner is decided at the end. Before the game is set up, you are going to be dealt or potentially allowed to draft 3 request cards. These are the set collections that I was just talking about. These are going to give you different ways of scoring points. And they say right here, for example, 4 points for having 2 of these 3 symbols off of those hex-based tiles that I just mentioned and showed you of the artifacts, because artifacts are different than the snow tiles you're sort of seeing around the edge of the camera right now. And you get to combine these, gather these, basically mix and match any sort of ones you want. And again, like I said, you can draft them if you prefer that variant, or it's sort of deal 5, keep 3. There will also be 3 individual objective cards that are just going to be overarching scoring goals for every player on the board. So those are going to be public knowledge. The last part of the first phase of things is a logbook, and you're going to have 3 logbook events happen because the first round doesn't trigger one. Every other subsequent beginning of round, you'll basically have an event card that happens that'll modify some way, tweak it in some sort, and give some variability to that round, a little bit of chaos at the same time, or a little bit of mitigation in a both positive and negative manner. The meat of the game, though, is really in the second round of things. That's where you're going to be doing the vast majority of your actions, exploring, delving, excavating, and everything else. Now, this is also where a main crux of this game is differing, second edition versus the first edition. One I already mentioned, 4 rounds. Now, the first game also had a couple more layers of tiles. As you can see here, we actually have 3 layers of tiles. We have the snow tile right here, then you have the lighter blue artifact tile right here, and then you have a little bit of a deeper artifact tile right here. And if you see, this actually is blank. I can pull one of these up and you can kind of see again how it gets revealed. And so that's a differing of the original first edition because there were 5. And the other main difference of this game is how you're taking those actions in this second main phase. As I just showed you on my individual player board here, I have 5 action points. Now on your turn, you do a rotation of everybody taking actions until everybody is out of action points. Most of your typical actions are going to cost 0, 1, or 2 actions. The difference, the other main difference in this game, which I think, I could see it happening as we were playing, that you are, or were, originally limited to 2 actions for 1 to 2 action points being spent. And I believe that included in the original edition your free actions as well. They've loosened up the rules a little bit and said you can take as many free actions as possible, and we'll talk about what those are in a minute, as well as 2 actions that will total at least 1 or 2 action points spent. So that means you're not going to have more than 5 turns, but you may also have as few as 3 turns, or maybe actually even 2, depending on how aggressive you are. It allows you to overwork. We'll talk about that later. So that is a big change because free actions are very, very important. It becomes important in how you're strategically putting out the archaeologists, as well as your expedition leaders and the camps that are going to either increase, decrease, or just change the amount of action points that are needed in your main action of excavating or removing these tiles in the first place, because that is what you're doing. That is how you get these artifact cards. That is how you get the actions that go along with them. That's how you scored the victory points on the set collections. All of that is directly tied into this. And so right now, if you were not a fan of the first edition for that reason, because it was a little bit too AP prone or was a little bit too difficult sometimes of managing the action system, I'm going to tell you right now, this works a lot better, because your turns, I think, feel more meaningful, because if you're really smart, you can get a couple free actions to go along with your action point requiring actions, if that makes sense. What are those actions though? Let's talk. All of these actions are going to be around the manipulation of that excavate action I just talked about. The first one is these camps. They come in neutral white. They come in your own individual player color. And how that's utilized is you get to place one of them out onto an empty tile, and then you get to grab your leader and place them both there together. And that's important because the next action is going to be calling archaeologists onto the board. And we'll talk about why archaeologists are so important is, well, because they actually reduce the cost of your actions when you're excavating. The more of these workers that you have to excavate a tile, right? The less energy it takes, the less actions it takes, the easier it is to get. You get more tiles, well, you do better. The second part of that action of placing archaeologists, instead, you can take your expedition leader and then place them in any camp instead, in case you already have, say, several archaeologists gathered, even if it's not my own camp. Third action, don't want to spend an action point this turn, need to maximize it for next turn, you get a plan token that can be saved that allows you to increase that track marker on the player board that I mentioned earlier up to 6, so you're starting action points for next round are going to be higher. Then you also have the ability, as I mentioned earlier, to overwork. That allows you to spend 3 action points in a turn, still utilizing only up to 2 costing actions in order to do more things on your turn by turn basis. The last other action that we have to talk about is getting one of these anima. And these are basically little study actions that you can have that get you wild card of each of the different symbols that we'll talk about that you saw in the set collections here, because there's 5 of these, just like there are 5 of these. And so these allow you an additional, basically free, to be able to use in those set collections later on. Now, the last action that I mentioned, obviously, is the major one. It's excavate. Excavate is the most important, and we're spending the most time on it because it's what you're going to be doing the most in the game. It is by far and away the most important thing, hands down whatsoever. And it has a few nuances to it. You have to take a tile that is, well, uncovered, but there are a few rules to that. It can be uncovered partially, but it doesn't have to be fully uncovered. If it's covered by 2 tiles right here, for example, this one, you can see it, right? This one and this one, can't excavate it. However, if this snow tile was excavated and then this is now exposed and only covered by 1, if I had my expedition leader on there, could then excavate that tile, causing this snow tile to then collapse. And when tiles are collapsed, they're just discarded. When tiles are excavated, they go into your hold. And that's tricky because you're going to have a hold pattern that you're going to be utilizing in one of 2 ways. And we'll talk about that in a second. The snow tiles, essentially, if you're familiar with these, there's less of them. There's less randomization of them overall in this edition. And there's just more useful activities and abilities with them. They all give you modifications, tweaks, or even just the same actions without actually having to take the action. The other nice thing about them is you don't have to wait a turn to use them. You get a snow tile, you use it right freaking away. I love that aspect of things. Now, the second and third layers are your artifacts, as you can see here. Now, you have a wild card here, so that's great. It can be put in any one of these slots. And then you start to see that the symbols are just going to be randomly aligned in all of the different layers. And so you're going to be trying to, we'll talk about that in a minute, trying to gather the ones that are going to behoove you the most with those aforementioned goal cards, secret for you, but also global objectives for everybody in the game. And that's going to be a more major important point. We'll talk about that. Don't let me forget that one. So that's excavation. Now there is a variant though, free-flowing ice, or, melting ice, I forget what it's called, but essentially it takes away that rule, that last one that I just talked about. It allows you to, have one be excavated if there's only 2 tiles instead of 3 holding it up, basically allowing you for quicker, faster, easier Excavation. Depending on your player count, depending on your skill level, that may or may not be something you're interested in. The last point about Excavation here that you need to know is it's also affected by how many people are there. Because normally Excavation, and again, this is another rule change from the previous edition. Snow only takes 2. It's different because Snow used to take 3, I believe, in the first edition. Snow takes 2. Artifacts take 3. The other aspect of this that happens is there's going to be other modifiers. If a camp is on it, if it has one of these little black peaks like mountainous ones, it's going to cost you an extra action point. However, these extra action points don't stack. So if you had a mountain one and a camp on it, it would still only cost you 1 extra, not 1 for each of those. So the max it can be raised by with whatever combination of things that may increase it doesn't change. Right? It's going to increase it by 1 no matter how many of those conditions are there, and that's very important. And then the opposite is true, right? I said more workers, more ease, right? For every worker, archaeologist, or leader you have on that tile, it reduces the cost by 1. So if I have 4 on this, it's not going to cost me anything to do. And that goes to those free actions that I was mentioning earlier. Free actions like that, free actions like playing the snow tiles. You do as many as you can as you want, which really potentially speeds up the game too, and deals with the analysis paralysis, which we'll talk about. So essentially, this game in a nutshell, based off of what I just said, is you utilizing the workers, the archaeologists out on the board, manipulating them, because the other aspect that I did not mention, the other last action, is moving your expedition leader, as well as potentially anywhere 1 to 3 archaeologists with them, 1 space. Obviously, you can do that from more than 1 space, and that's also ways that can be mitigated with some of the snow tiles, the asymmetric abilities that I briefly touched upon as each player character has as their faction. As you're gathering these tiles, then you hit your final phase. After you've taken all of your actions, all of your action points are used up, you go to the end of the day. And why this matters is because we're going to go back to this player board a second here. This player board is going to be used to gather these tiles and place them on their corresponding spots. Chroma, the wild ones, can be placed anywhere, but once they're placed there for a round, they stay there. And so you're going to gather these as you go, and you're then going to have to make a very important decision, because during the game, if you have at least 2 of these little dots on the bottom here, you can see on this one, then you get to activate these abilities, because all of these different artifacts actually have asymmetric abilities that can be, again, used to deal with your conditions on the board in the first place. And so then it gives you an additional way, a free action, if you will, like I mentioned earlier, of more and more things, more and more combos, more and more to actually do. But if you use them, you just flip them over to indicate you've used them. But you have to have 2. So for example, if this chroma here has 2, this green one only actually has 1. So I would have to have another green tile in order to use it. Then here's the tricky part. These are great and they stay out there for as long as you want. But at the end of your round, you have the ability to grab up to 2, 3, or 4, or even 5 and store them into your hold. Because only these tiles, your set collection tiles, right? You see where I'm going with this, will use scoring wise for those cards that I showed you earlier. Not if they're here, only if they're here. They can't be on the board. So you have to take away the powers here at the right time, put them into your hold, because you can only do so many on a single round. Therein lies a little bit of the decision making as well. And at the end of the game, if they're out here, you just lose them. They don't get counted for anything. So you really need to make high utilization of them, but manipulation at the right time as well. Now, the last point that is, to go along with this is, if you don't like your starting 3, or you just don't have enough starting 3, you can actually spend a victory point potentially to get more of this, because they've included a draft at the end of your turn at the round, so that there are a number of these face up waiting for you at the end of your round, so that you can buy them or acquire them for more victory points potentially to fulfill them in the first place. That's the game. You play that 4 times and you're done. So, what do I think? Pros, cons, and everything else in between. Now, I did not mention, we'll talk about this just slightly before that, I guess. There are some variants here, and they talk about this. This is an Edifices booklet. It runs you through just a couple of the different variants here. A sentry worm that goes around and moves your archaeologists out of the way and bumps them. And then, a couple other things like the impossible polyhedron. We won't talk about that. But the monolithic lotus here, and basically it's a catch-up mechanic. The person with the least amount of artifacts gets an extra point. So you get to move your exploration point, your action points up by 1, or the accelerated antenna here, that goes back to saying some of the artifacts in the center of the board may be unusable. So if you excavate down to them, you're just lost as soon as they're exposed. So just for different little twists on the game as a whole. The last other twist that they've included with this one is, again, a variant of asymmetric powers here that gets slotted out next to the board, and you can spend, again, a victory point to get these stronger asymmetric abilities that are correlating to the factions in the first place of all 7 factions, as you can see here. Getting more request cards, your set collection point cards, as I mentioned, sending an artifact to your city, but don't take any tokens, move any, without any explorers on it. Again, just all little variants to give you ways of sort of mitigating. And I really kind of like this. So this is a pro, but at the same time, it's a little bit of a con, because I've never been completely, and this is maybe a personal con. We'll start with a personal con. I've never really been comfortable spending victory points to earn more victory points, right? And that's a personal bias, con, deficiency, whatever you want to say, right? Like, it's just hard for me to do up in here. But it forces people to have to plan out accordingly. Are you spending points to actually get more points, or are you spending points in order to potentially get more points? How smart are you in that sense? And that leads into both the pro and the con of this game as a whole, as I alluded to at the beginning, right? 5 tribes. It's a little bit thinky in terms of the potential for analysis paralysis. Now, I'll say, as I mentioned at the beginning as well, having the 4 rounds and having the now as many free actions as you want frees you up in that sense. You don't have to be as thinky. But it's going to be heavily, heavily group dependent on that because of that aspect. And at a higher player count, 4 or 5, it's going to be a tough dynamic. It's going to be better because excavating, even with these more free actions here, this is like an end game board state, as you're seeing in front of you, close to, of 2 players. And so 2 players do not excavate very much at all. It's difficult to get down and deep. And I didn't talk about getting down to the bottom layer, because if you actually get down to the bottom layer and you uncover a whole covered area here, you get just a victory point. But you don't get the breadth or the depth of exploration at the lower player counts. But at the higher player counts, you're going to be potentially stuck behind some other people that, if they aren't, like me, and impatient and just wanting to make the first decision that they think is halfway decent, then that's the balance that you got to worry about, because this game could be potentially, up to 2 hours then, in that sense, at the higher player counts. And I think also the rounds has helped with that. I think only having 3 instead of 5 layers significantly helps that. The snow decreased cost helps that extraordinarily, because now a lot of the time you're getting those snow tiles for free. And so you can get at least 1, if not 2 snow tiles if you're very clever on a turn, which again gives you more possibilities, more combos, but it makes your own individual turn potentially longer, even though somehow you just did 3 or 4 things and only spent, 1 action point, maybe 2. So that is the big dilemma of this game. And it doesn't get away from that, I would argue, with the first edition to the second edition. It makes some of those things better, but it's not going to eliminate them. And that's why, if you weren't a fan of them in the first game, I can't tell you that it's going to change your mind, but I'm going to tell you that it definitely addressed those issues with this edition. Not having played the first one, but yeah. The other big feeling in general, because at the lower player counts, especially because you're not able to excavate as much of this map as a whole, with these cards that you're going for, there is the real potential to feel like you are going for what is convenient, what is directly under you, what is going to take you less actions to get to, so that you can just excavate purely more, rather than strategically solely going for the ones that you have in the first place, which is why the draft variant of these is helpful. But if you don't know where you're located on the map, you may have to be getting those other request cards. So again, that goes back to my first point of how do you feel about spending points to potentially get more points because you didn't get the ones that were close to you underneath initially. Now, the hopping of the leader around is going to be helpful, especially at the higher player counts. You can hop over to someone's area much quicker, but it's still not going to get rid of that completely. And again, I can see people being concerned about that. The snow tiles are very, very helpful. The excavation of the manipulation is a very clever mechanic. I love it. I love also the fact that they simplified it out and they said, hey, there's 3 or 4 things that will increase the cost of excavation, but don't worry, they don't stack. So you're not having to sit there and say, well, it was this, this, and this, which adds to this and this, and then we're subtracting this, this. I mean, it's not a big thing, but how many times do you want to sit there remembering which ones add up and which ones don't, and how is this, and did we do this right, and was it enough? Like, you just don't have to think about it. It's like, okay, do I have 4 guys on a tile? I do. I have 4 guys on an artifact tile. Then I'm going to excavate it for free no matter what. Or do I have 3 on a snow tile no matter what? Great, done, free, don't need to think. And so it eliminates a little of that aspect of things, which is a very nice blessing. And to be frank with you, I thought when this first came to crowdfunding, I remember looking at this and going, that's kind of gimmicky, right? And I use gimmicky all the time in some of my videos of, novelty, right? At the same time, there are gimmicks that work from a mechanical standpoint too. Canvas, for example. I would argue that this tile laying, especially with the 3 now instead of the 5, I rather enjoyed the actual mechanic of going through these tiles. The randomization of them, that's where a lot of you Euro folks are going to have the trouble, like I mentioned, of just digging down and not having the right one pop up, or not just having the availability of the right ones with your scoring cards. So my concern is that still the balance of the ones you're getting, the powers that may be on the player cards to then affect that might not be quite to your liking. Also, again, play length for what it is. The setup and teardowns, not an issue, right? You're just laying tiles down randomly. This board, you can't see, it's 4 pieces, but it's really freaking cool. It's got magnets to put them together instead of folding, which, again, it's awesome. I really like that because if you're like me, I've been digging more into playmats because I hate folding these boards and having like the edge tear up, and you can just see it on some of these not as well made ones, even after like 1 or 2 plays. You can just see it and it just drives me crazy. So the fact that this was magnetic, I'm not going to break it apart here, but you can kind of see it. Like I can bend this, right? And I can bend it this way and, it's cool. And yeah, as I mentioned, the edifices, I mean, they are going to be slight variations of the tiles, as I mentioned, in terms of the worms and those artifacts, and just slight variations that are going to be allowable. But things like, melting the glaciers faster for excavation purposes, having a free slide ability when you're playing with the 2 players that allows you to move 2 spaces instead of 1 once a turn. Just small things like that to speed it up, almost become potentially must-haves rather than a variant too. And that always feels a little bit tricky because as not a designer whatsoever, like how do you choose what gets included and what doesn't get included to balance people like myself and the heavy Euro people that are, ultimately vying for interest in this game in the first place. Again, so final thoughts on this one. I'd say the biggest argument is going to be the potential for ease of access of the tiles that you're going for versus the optimization of trying to move elsewhere to get the ones that you may potentially need to score these. And I just don't know how it's going to make you feel of really kind of wanting to go for the ease of access over the thing that you're supposed to be going for, to do this. And sometimes then the person who just has those 2 things line up might win, rather than the person that action optimized the best overall, especially if you're, like I said, one of those heavier Euro folks that really wants to be rewarded on that. It engages you. The action elements of things, I would argue also, just keeping track of how many action points you used could be a small, spur in your side, if you will. but I like the free-flowing, the easy nature of getting now these top tiles and even just excavation in general. I really like the mechanic of digging down below, and it surprised me in that sense. I wasn't expecting to like it as much in that, truth be told, right? You have an idea of what this game is until you play a game like this and you go, oh, right? And I think that's the biggest thing more than anything else for anyone looking at this game and interested is going, do I truly know how this is going to feel for me? Because I didn't know that. And so pleasantly surprised in a lot of ways of how the smooth mechanistic approach worked and the action points of taking them on a turn-by-turn basis. But there's also a lot to mitigate. And I don't feel like with some of this you can mitigate as much as you may like if you're one of those people that enjoys truly having complete control of all of the elements. The asymmetric powers are nice, but I'd also argue that I'm not quite sure how they all balance. I'm not good at telling that sort of thing, especially with, limited plays as a prototype. You may have one that suits your needs. You may have one that you feel is better equipped or better powered based on the board state, or one that's slightly more or less useful. And I can't speak to that to any degree. Ultimately, I think the changes that they've made from second edition to first edition here improve the game significantly. Just knowing what it would be like if a few of these weren't in there. But like I said, I'm not sure if you weren't a fan of the game in the first place, this is going to be enough of a change from some of those critiques that I mentioned to completely change your mind. But it's unique. It's doing something very different that I have not seen and I really like in general. But again, my biggest barrier nowadays is playtime. And so at the higher player counts, I'm going to have to sacrifice having to have more playtime, which is going to give maybe a richer experience of the game. But that also means ultimately for me personally, it's going to be a little harder to get to the table because, that window is still very hard nowadays, especially with all the competition. So that ultimately is my dilemma. If it were, again, slightly shorter, and again, that's going to be dependent on the player count there. Because higher player count, longer playtime, more exploration, depth, control of the board state in the first place. But are you willing to make that balance and sacrifice worth it, especially if you do like the game like I do? And the answer, honestly, in my head right now is I don't know. I don't know. Because I could also see just playing and going and saying, okay, great. Not perfect dural optimization, but quick, crisp, Liege, boom, boom, boom. Enjoy it. Have fun with it. Try and score good, but, no AP at my table. So, there you go. That is ice. Ice. Baby. Straight face there. Dad pun to end the video. There you go. That's all I got. Have a great day. This way. Thank you for sending me the prototype to talk about. Stay classy. See you around.